Hello, puppies and kittens. Once again, we're interviewing another author. This is Katherine Stewart. She is the author of, what was that book? Well, I can't remember. What was the book about the I can't believe I had it on the top of my head as soon as I started. I completely blew this.
The Power Worshippers Inside.
No. It's about your old book, the one that
I wrote about the religious
News Club. I completely spaced that right at the wrong moment.
Right.
And what was the rest of the title on that one?
It's the Christian Rights Stealth Assault on America's Children.
Yeah, that made such an impact in the atheist community. And I remember I met you at a conference of some sort once upon a time where you were.
It might have been American Atheists, but there were a lot of conferences out there.
Yeah, you've probably met 2 or 3 times, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I remember that book made a huge splash, at least in our community. How did it do nationally?
I think it was really interesting. I got letters from people coast to coast because when I published the book, there were about 2,700 Good News Clubs operating in public elementary schools around the country. And today the number has grown. I think there are close to 6,000. Now, remember, these Good News Clubs target children in the very earliest years of learning. The centerpiece of their program is called The Wordless Book. It's used to convert children who are too young to read to a very fundamentalist form of evangelical Christianity. And they confuse little children into thinking that their public school endorses their religion, that this is a religion their public school wants them to learn. So, I mean, anyone who has little kids or who's ever worked with them knows that they can't distinguish between an activity in their school and one that's sponsored by their school. So they're in these public schools. And as a consequence, they're using their position in the public school to confuse children attending the club, that their school wants them to endorse this religion, but also create a sense among all school children that there is a so-called correct version of religion, one that's in their public school, and a wrong religion, which is everybody else, wrong religious perspectives.
And this often includes where people where parents will have a different religion than is being taught to the kids, and to just dismiss that. It's completely insidious. So as I said, that made a huge impact.
Yeah.
On our community.
Parents around the country, parents who said they sent their kids to Good News Clubs not knowing what they were, and their kids would come home and say, "Mommy, we're going to go to hell because we go to the wrong kind of church." And I saw in community after community, these insertion of these types of religious initiatives are so divisive. But as I was researching Good News Clubs, I realized that they were just one part of a much larger attack on public education as a whole. And the attack on public education was just one small part of a much larger attack on America itself as a modern constitutional democracy.
So now you have the new book, The Power Worshippers. And I was saying about the old one, it was like every secular activist was intimately familiar with your talks and everything, and all the information that you brought up on that. And it was wildfire across our community. Now, tell me about this one.
Well, the Power Worshippers, the subtitle is Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. We're seeing the consequences of decades of infrastructure building in this movement, religious nationalism, or what many people call Christian nationalism. The movement consists of a variety of both for-profit and non-profit organizations, right-wing policy groups, legal activist groups, data initiatives, messaging platforms. It doesn't have so much a leader, but a collection of leaders that often are interpersonally connected. Many of them, of course, have unprecedented access and influence in today's White House. And the movement is really stable because they have, it's not like a one leader movement. It's like a sort of broad movement with all of these sort of pieces, moving parts. It's like a machinery. So I feel like we can't really meet the challenges we face as a society unless we really know what we're up against. So I tried to get inside that machinery. I did a lot of first-person reporting, went to all these right-wing gatherings and conferences and strategy meetings, spoke to both the leadership of the movement and also many members of the rank and file. What I've discovered is that this really, people still look at the Christian right in a way through a so-called culture war lens. They think it's centered on issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and the like, but it's not. It's a political movement, and it wants power.
So this reminds me of two things. One, why we had what was it called, a series of, or waves of great revivals or awakenings, which is ironic. Put the brain to sleep and call it an awakening. That was a response to our extremely secular founding fathers, who were, some of whom were Christian, some of whom were nominally Christian, and some of whom just didn't have an excuse to call themselves full-out atheist, but were very, very close. In a pre-Darwinian age, I think it was virtually impossible to
the deists would have been and were often considered heretics for sure.
Exactly. So there was a reaction to that, which was amongst the uneducated masses, that they have these huge revivals. Of course, it was country, rural people, and not the educated elite that were involved in these. And so you get the grassroots change of religious fundamentalism taking over a once secular country. And then, as you said, it's been going on for decades, and we've seen for 4 decades over the 20th century, and certainly over the course of my lifetime, we've been seeing case after case where court cases where the religious right are trying to grab a little bit more and a little bit more. And then when they lose something, well, then they try to find a way to skirt around that and just get around the law and keep doing it anyway, which is frustrating. And the reason that I became an activist, some 20 some odd years ago, was because people were confessing to me online how their collection of churches had all been, the whole congregation votes exactly the way the minister tells them to, and all of these different churches are in communication with each other so that everybody votes exactly the way they're all told, so that they have a block so that they can elect certain extreme right-wing conservative judges and senators and school board members and dog catchers and everything. They just want to replace everybody at every level of state and federal government with extreme right-wing religious conservatives. And they have basically done that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was researching my book, Power Worshippers, I write about this in my first chapter. Actually, I center a couple of chapters around this. The movement has developed these networks of pastors who are sort of conservative-leaning pastors. The networks include like Watchmen on the Wall. It's an initiative of the Family Research Council. That's one of the leading policy groups of the religious right. And they have this network called Watchmen on the Wall. And they've got tens of thousands of affiliated pastors in this network. And so they invest a huge amount of money and resources in messaging to these pastors the correct issues that should matter in election cycles, and they give them really sophisticated tools for communicating this message to their congregations in order to turn out the vote for the hyper-conservative political candidates that the movement favors. So just to give you an idea what that looks like, I went to an event at a small church in rural North Carolina that was held by the Watchmen on the Wall. It was drawing in pastors from conservative-leaning churches from the area, and they were, once you got there, supposedly a nonpartisan event, but every single speaker hit home like, we need to talk about abortion. We need to talk about, it was really like abortion. When they're talking to the rank and file, or when they're talking to the pastors about the issues that matter or should matter to the rank and file, it's all abortion all the time. Abortion is the beginning and the end. And I want to show you just a couple things. They gave them like voter guides that leave absolutely no question as to which way to vote, your so-called biblical values. They're like 6 questions, and maybe 2 or 3 of them are about abortion. And there's one about prayer in schools, and there's one about their conception of so-called religious liberty, which is not freedom of conscience or anything like that, or freedom of worship even. It's really the right of people with a certain correct beliefs to discriminate against others of whom they disapprove. So they know very well, if you can boil down, get people to vote on 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. So they invest, resources, trying to deliver that message. I brought a couple of props here. This is something I got at that event. It's called a Culture Impact Team Manual, How to Establish a Ministry at Your Church. Now that would seem confusing, right? Isn't a church a ministry? But what they're doing is directing these pastors to establish groups within their churches that are teams of congregants will communicate to other congregants the correct way to vote on certain issues. And now this is like a really sophisticated document. It's like about 150 pages of tab material. And so it's obviously abortion. They talk about, creationism. When they talk about environmental science, they point the congregants to a single resource, which is a creationist resource. What is it? The Dick Ham's thing? You know the one I'm talking about, right?
Answers in Genesis.
Answers in Genesis. They're talking about the Cornwall Alliance. These are like the Answers in Genesis believes that in creationism, it's like, and they're advocating this to all these pastors in the churches. So if they can get like the congregants to talk to other congregants, see, this is what you have to do, and this is how you need to vote, and these are the ways to understand these issues. So in a way, like in election cycles, these churches, it's almost like they turn into, shadow cells of a shadow political party, I would say. So they're just really investing a lot of resources into, and here's another thing. Here's a really interesting data tool that they had. They were giving pastors tools through another sort of data initiative where the pastor can compare voter rolls against church membership lists and see what percentage of their congregation voted in the last election. And they even had a tool so they could look up whether an individual congregant voted in the last election. So you can just imagine some of the conversations that would emerge from this kind of information. Mrs. Smith, I see you didn't vote in the last election. Don't you know you need to vote your biblical values? So I really, in the book, The Power Worshippers, I went to a lot of these types of events and really got deep into some of these organizations and showed how it works on the ground.
Excuse me, I have my world is turned upside down by these damn dogs. And one of them knows how to open the door, and the other one, right here, knows how to climb the fence.
What are your dogs' names?
This one, hold on, come here. Does not come when you call him. Great Pyrenees apparently don't come when you call them.
Wow, that's impressive.
This is Falcor.
Hi.
But as I say, he knows how to jump. He knows how to climb the fence, and I can't have the door open right now. The other dog's opened the door. Give me just a second to close it.
Okay.
So I have absolutely no professionalism since getting that dog.
Right. It's worth it, right?
Oh, yeah, let me ponder that. Okay. All right, so we were talking about it. I was going to suggest, or I was going to comment that somebody wise had said once upon a time that religion is the means of manipulation of the masses, and how obvious is that? The whole prayer in school thing has nothing to do with our rights, has nothing to do with biblical values. It has to do with controlling what people believe so that you can control how they vote, so that you can extort financial, social, and political support. Mm-hmm. And that's it. And so it is a beautiful way to do that is to tell people that there's some inescapable despot who watches everything that they do every minute of every day and knows every secret they have. So they can't get away with anything. They can't keep anything hidden. So they think that they have to then bow and kowtow to the people who pretend to talk to this guy.
Well, it's a way of amassing political power. And you see it certainly in the Trump administration where, did you watch the Republican National Convention?
No. I mean, very often I will watch. I watch political commentary almost constantly, and sometimes I watch like the Trinity Broadcast Network just to piss myself off.
That's funny.
But sometimes when it's like a descent into madness.
Well, it's amazing. It's sort of, I think for anybody watching the Republican National Convention, they can see that the threat of religious authoritarianism is really entrenched, unfortunately, in one of our major political parties. I mean, I think, God talk has always been a fixture at both major party conventions. But this year, the RNC, to some degree, and often I think, with some nod to an acknowledgement of the diversity of religion in our country. But this year, I think the RNC was really something special. There's so many, politicians who wear their sanctimony on their sleeves, like Pence, of course, Housing and Urban Secretary, Development Secretary Ben Carson, Pompeo was piping in from Jerusalem. But it was like the tone and variety was much more stark this year. It was sort of like the election was cast as a choice between absolute good and absolute evil. So Donald Trump Jr. said, people of faith are under attack. The choice is between, church, God, and school, or looting and marauding and anarchy. I'm like, really, nothing in between? Like that's, and by the way, which church are you talking about? Are you talking about, Evangelical Church, United Methodist Church, the Church of Satan? Like, what are you talking about? We have irreducible pluralism and religious pluralism in our country. Donald Trump himself has said, Joe Biden is against God. He's against the Bible. He's going to hurt God.
Yes, Joe Biden is going to hurt God.
He said that. Trump said that. I mean, they're really trying to, cast this election in these absolute apocalyptic terms as a way of trying to get people who have any kind of, faith perspective on Trump's side. But it's also a way of signaling that there is a so-called correct way to believe in our society and an incorrect way to believe. And they're using it as a kind of way to try to heap contempt on people who don't believe correctly. Now, I want to point out this has been done throughout history. Pro-slavery theologians, for instance, attacked abolitionist leaders as atheistic and as communist. I actually want to read a quote from my book, if you don't mind. Do you mind? It's there's a pro-slavery theologian, one of the leading pro-slavery theologians, named James Henley Thornwell of South Carolina. So he's describing the conflict between slavery and abolition. The religious right would like you to think the fundamentalists were all on the side of the abolitionists, right? They weren't. Okay, most wealthy, many of the sort of pro-slavery theologians were actually defending the slaveholder. They were defending the side of wealth. So here's this James Henley Thornwell. He wrote, the parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. He said they're atheists, socialists, communists on the one side, on the side of the abolitionist, and friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. So people who are arguing for equality, people who are arguing for a sort of more equitable society are often accused of being atheistic. And it's really interesting. Frederick Douglass himself noted that, yes, there were some theologians arguing for abolition, and they were arguing from, he called them humble pulpits. I described about a dozen of them in my book, The Power Worshippers. But he said the wealthy ones, the well-connected ones, the politically empowered ones, he called them the $5,000 divines, because that was $5,000 was a lot of money back then. He said they're all on the side of the slaveholder, the sort of wealthier theologians. So this has been, I think when people have argued for more equitable, pluralistic society, they're often accused of atheism. And I think that, the religious right today attacks secularists or critical thinkers. And I think one reason for that is that it can be, difficult to sustain religious belief systems. And one way in which it's sustained is by the demonization of those who do not believe. And I think you find this in many religions and throughout history. The religious right in the US is hardly the only group that is trying to, cast those who think critically as blasphemers and heretics and amoral. But, you know, there's another more salient political explanation today, and I think that's that the religious right's political leaders understand when people are secular, they reject the authority of religion and laws that are common to all in a pluralistic society. They're going to reject the theocratic model of power. So it's interesting. I mean, if you look at partisan identification today, it's almost as big a separator as race. 77% of the so-called nuns voted for Democrats. It's more predictive than being female. Being secular means you're not going to support a political system that is based on reactionary religion.
The polarization that we have going on right now stems largely from completely binary thinking. One of the things that I have to keep reminding people is that, you know, there's not just a right and a left. You know, there's a far right, and you're on it, by the way, and to the person I'm talking to, and there's a far left, and I'm not on it, by the way. And you know, there's a middle too.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, everybody else has a middle. Just the United States doesn't have a middle, and a lot of people say that the middle is liberal. That's the middle, not the left. So the left is something different. But yeah, having to explain to people that there's there's a gradation, or that there's nuance, or that everything isn't completely black and white like they think. It's bizarre to me that you can't be here. I live in Texas, and I went to a political rally, and one of the Republican speakers was advocating for education, and they said that if you support education, you're going to have to vote for the other party. But in the same speech, he also said that, now I know that we are Texas Republicans. We were born Republican, and we owe our party some allegiance. But you're born Republican? I have a hard time with that.
The religious right has become increasingly, you know, people accuse sometimes the left of playing purity politics. I actually think the right plays them harder. You know, there's
they certainly do the snowflake thing more than we do.
Oh, they do, and there's no room to deviate on the certain issues. Like, you know, it used to be the Republican Party was more moderate, and there was a variation among attitudes about abortion. Say there were a lot of pro-choice Republican parties and individuals. Let's remember that, you know, Ronald Reagan signed into law the most liberal abortion law in 1967. Betty Ford hailed abortion liberalization as a great, great decision. These people could not have a career in Republican politics anymore. Isn't that amazing? Because they've become so extreme on this one issue. They've also, they're incredibly extreme on, like at the RNC, there was not a single word that would offend some of the party's most, like the most plutocratic funders, people like, you know, thinking about Betsy DeVos and her family, or the family of the fracking Wilkes, you know, fracking billionaires, the Wilkes brothers, or some of the other sort of really large scale funders of the Republican Party that are advocating for a kind of hyper, like a libertarian far right, you know, economic positions. And they've welded that to a sort of hyper conservative religion in a way. So,
yeah. So I deal with the conservatives on the Texas State Board of Education, right, for long, and they have policies that they will not endorse evolution. They will not teach evolution. But there's another one where they have a debt to American exceptionalism, which I find scary. See, the conservatives on the Board of Education have actually done more damage to our history classes than to our science classes.
I know.
In eliminating people of color, eliminating any. They tried to remove Justice, I think, Thurgood Marshall.
Unbelievable. I mean,
they tried to remove it. They did not want to have any black role models in position of power that could be seen as somebody you would look up to. Right. And instead, they also wanted to remove Thomas Jefferson and replace him with Jefferson Davis.
It just boggles the mind. But this is how you build an authoritarian movement. You don't build it through consensus and compromise and education. You build it by compelling everyone to adhere to extreme and irrational positions, and then by insisting, of course, that they declare their absolute fealty to an extreme and irrational leader. I mean, remember, they're often referring to Trump as a King Cyrus or King David figure, an imperfect ruler through whom God chose to enact his will. Paula White, she's got a position in the White House, like director of faith and outreach or something. She said
that obvious sham. What
I know.
How is she not obvious to absolutely everybody who sees her? You are a stupid person and you don't know what you're talking about. Shut up. That's the appropriate response to her.
Very good at manipulating people, obviously. What's really interesting? She was part of a group of 6 or 7 pastors that were investigated in 2006 by a Republican-led committee led by Charles Grassley, as a Republican. And they were looking at these pastors like Paula White, when she had her Without Walls Church, and who is it? Is it Kent Blackwell? There's some other, pastors, maybe Creflo Dollar, these prosperity gospel pastors who had amassed all of this wealth, like unbelievable houses, not just airplanes, but airplane leasing companies, all of which was tax exempt. And Grassley and his fellow Republicans on the Senate committee, we're the party of fiscal responsibility. Why do you guys have tax exempt status? An airplane leasing company, all these unbelievable mega mansions, and that's all tax exempt. And they were accused of being of sort of bigotry, religious bigotry, Charles Grassley and his fellow Republicans, because these pastors did not want to have their taxes scrutinized. They did not want to have to open their books. They didn't want to have anybody look at their profits. And Paula White was in that group. And they all sort of pushed back. The pastors pushed back and said this is a violation of their religious freedom. And then the Senate committee, they backed off. And they, instead of really doing an investigation, they said, well, you guys really need to self-monitor. How's that working, the self-monitoring?
Yeah. So Ronald Reagan, as you said, was in a position where he's venerated in the party now as an honored figure from memorial time, and yet they're overturning his laws and policies, which is surprising to me. And as you said, the donors effectively own everything, and so the Koch brothers at one point basically bought out the Republican Party. So the Republican Party was owned by the fossil fuel industry, and then of course that's where we get the policy in the Board of Education that they will not teach anthropogenic climate change.
I know, it's really shocking. You have to teach it to your own kids. You can't wait for your school to teach it.
Why will they not teach it? Because that would be an affront to the fossil fuel industry, who now owns the political party who governs over our education.
Well, it's interesting. There's one of the think tanks. It's called the Heartland Institute. It's received some support from the family of the DeVos Prince family. They actually produced I think that was maybe supported. I can't remember if it was directly or through a donor group, but there was some way that money was directed from one place to another. So they put out a curriculum that was intended actually to sow kind of questions about climate change. It's almost like promoting a kind of misinformation in the schools about this. It's really a shame. Betsy DeVos, her family they're big funders at the very start of the religious right there. Money from that family, the extended family, has flowed to the creation of the Family Research Council, Heartland Institute, the Acton Institute, which has decried public education. One of their papers decried public education. There are organizations like the Mackinac Center that have also made an effort to sow distrust in public schools and promote a sort of extreme version of what they call school choice, which is direct taxpayer funding of religious schools. So here's another place that her family directed their money. $5.5 million went from the DeVos Prince family to the ministry of a fellow named D. James Kennedy. This is a pamphlet he published. It's called A Godly Education. So $5.5 million. That's not just a guy reached out his hand, we gave him some money. No, $5.5 million is a lot of money. Their family had a huge relationship with this guy. So he wrote this pamphlet. It was actually a sermon of his. It's called A Godly Education. I want to read you a quote from the back. This is what he said about public schools. He said, "My friends, the anti-Christian, anti-God bias the censorship of all things Christian, the infusion of an atheistic, amoral, evolutionary, socialistic, one world, anti-American system of education in our public schools has indeed become such that if it had been done by an enemy, it would have been considered an act of war.
So here again, we have all of these associated statements.
Is saying about public ed, this is what this guy says about public ed, and they gave him $5.5 million. I mean,
And so anybody who is anybody who's atheist is also a socialist somehow. Anybody who is atheist is also anti-American and amoral. When we look at the Christian right, I see a whole lot of amoral people and nothing remotely American about that. So I am trying my best to preserve the Constitution that is constantly under attack by the Christian right, by the religious conservatives, and certainly by Trump, who has tried to go against every single provision of the First Amendment. Don't say anything about the Second Amendment, and then they'll think that they're safe and not realize that you've taken away the first.
That's true. I mean, the thing is that in their minds, this is an enemy-driven movement. That is the people who, are part of it are united in their conviction that they face a diabolical enemy, who represents an existential threat to what they want. It's like, have you ever heard the expression, don't get between the tiger and its food? They want, of course, laws that privilege them. They want access to power, but more than anything, they want access to public money. Like if you look at the policies they're pursuing in public education and in so many areas, they want direct taxpayer funding of religious organizations. And frankly, under the Trump administration, they're getting it. We can return to that. But so they really want that, and they see secularists and people who don't sort of agree with a theocratic model of government as the thing that's in the way with that. So they have this persecution narrative. Anything that fails to affirm them is somehow oppressive to them, and that persecution narrative is really critical to them in building their base. So this is why members of the movement will often cast themselves as the most persecuted and put upon group in society, even as they're the only ones forcing their programs in public schools in any large numbers. Like if some critical thinking club opens in a school in upstate New York, all of a sudden everybody covers it. Oh my gosh, critical thinking in public schools. Meanwhile, we have nearly 6,000 Good News Clubs operating in public schools around the country, and nobody's talking about it.
And when you did that, at the same time, the Texas version of the Republican Party platform actually wrote in that they were against critical thinking.
No, I saw that. That was amazing.
So part of the polarization that we have is like once upon a time, like when I was a kid, it seemed like everybody had this middle of the road position where you would accept that science, you'd be a fool to deny science. And at the same time, everybody had this idea that you go somewhere after you die, that you have a spirit that comes out of you and goes somewhere. This is like everybody. And you had on the very fringes, you would have the wackaloon people who denied science, and you had the hardcore atheist people who would actually come out and say, no, there's none of this. That was rare. But now, religion is in steep decline. Every state, every country, or not every country, but around the world, in terms of general numbers, it's in a definite state of decline. Yet, simultaneously, while atheism is on the rise in every state and around the world, religious extremism is also on the rise. Religion in general is on the decline, but religious extremism is on the rise. And the only way that those numbers correlate is, and certainly in the United States population, is we're getting it divided pretty well in half. Mm-hmm. So we have the rise of atheism already representing roughly a third of the people, and most of them don't realize that they are atheists because, running with the wrong definition or calling themselves humanist or whatever it is, calling themselves agnostic, what have you. But the people who don't believe in a God are already accounting for at least a third of the population, and more than a third, like 46%, very close to half, are turning into the extreme religion. And when you talk to them on individual basis, you find out it's more like a third, but they're calling themselves almost half, like 46% polling. Again,
well, it's interesting. I've looked a little bit into some of the sociological data, and I've looked at the work of somebody like George Barna, for instance. He's an evangelical pollster who gave, just talking about in terms of just America. Let's just look at America for now. So, he said the most devoted religious right supporters, he calls them SAGE-CONs, which is an acronym for strategically active, governance engaged conservatives. It's something like, I can't remember what the acronym stands for off the top of my head, but he said they number only 10% of the population. These are the most extreme folks, but they vote in highly disproportionate numbers. So in 2016, 91% turned out to vote, and 93% of those turned out to vote for Trump. So this shows why, one of the reasons why the religious right has disproportionate political power. I think people often make the mistake of assuming that in a country like the United States, whatever proportion of the country is, like voters, you're going to get that proportion in your vote. It's not true. In a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, and an additional number have their votes disenfranchised through race-based gerrymandering, voter suppression, all the kind of dirty tricks we're starting to see now, the messing with the post office and everything. But even before, 2020, in 2016, there was a lot of voter suppression, purging the voter rolls, et cetera. It doesn't take a majority to win an election. All it takes is a really motivated, disproportionate minority. So I was at a Road to Majority conference a couple of years ago, and I heard Ralph Reed talk, and he said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. That doesn't matter. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And so here's the reason why they vote in disproportionate numbers. The only reason they have that power is because they have invested for decades in all the tools of modern political campaigns, data, media, and messaging. And they, can get out the churches to vote in large numbers. They can get out their people to vote in large numbers because they have just very strategic tools to get people to vote in disproportionate numbers. I want to return to something you said about the world. There's a wonderful book published a couple of years ago by two editors of The Economist. I can't remember the title of. It's called God is Back. It's a really interesting book, and it notes that the hotter forms of religion, the more extreme forms of religion, are on the rise all around the globe. And it's very interesting. They sort of posit some explanations for that. They think the sort of very vast, quick pace of technological change has left a lot of people searching for answers. But more than that, I think hyper-conservative religions are very, often very unified in their messaging. They're unified. They sort of employ very effective tools for messaging, make sure to get people on the same page, and also very aggressively go after more moderate forms of religion. You even see that in the Trump administration, where people who are, 350 faith leaders of all faiths just came out and endorsed Joe Biden. And this was called, they're accused of being so-called godless, because that's the worst thing they think they can accuse people of. They work so hard to equate godlessness with communism, or I don't know, whatever else they think they can tar it with. So.
Yeah, and I don't remember. I don't remember where I was going to go with that. In the polarization where we have the hardcore extremists, again, we're just talking about black and white thinking. You're either, if you're left, then you're atheist and you're a socialist, or you're a communist, because we don't know there's a difference between socialism and communism. Then there's there's not democratic social, or there's not social democrat. These are nuances. We don't deal with those anymore. There's no such thing as shades of gray. And on the left, we have, or not just on the left, but but let's just say my demographic, whatever my demographic is, I recognize a spectrum of color, that there's extenuating circumstances and there's other details and circumstances of and I almost had it back where I was going. And I lost it again. Oh well. You were talking about the rise in extreme religion, and it reminded me of two things, and I lost one of them when I tried to get back to it.
But it's interesting that the Trump administration has also become, really allied with groups like, if you look at, Duda and now in Poland, or if you look at Erdogan in Turkey, or Orban in Hungary, or Putin in Russia, when these leaders bind themselves to religious ultra-conservatives in their countries in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of power. We rightly recognize this as a form of religious nationalism, and we're seeing that today with the Trump administration, with his alliances with, sort of some of the own religious hyper-conservative leaders. I used the term religious nationalism explicitly in my subtitle because I wanted to draw that parallel with other forms of religious nationalism around the world. And in fact, in last chapter of my book, I go to some of these gatherings of what they call the global conservative movement, the movement of these sort of leaders and interests, those sort of right-wing religious interests around the world. So I went to a World Congress of Families in gathering, which took place that year in Verona, Italy, where speakers said, declared themselves to be at war with global liberalism, with secularism. They claimed to be defending the family, but in fact, what they're really trying to do is they're allying with almost like, with plutocratic power and plutocratic money, and setting themselves against the idea of human equality, human rights, and the like. It's a very interesting event, and I wrote about it. I mean, there are nuances that are specific to different countries, but what representatives of, one of the speakers, he's the head of a sort of global policy group. He said, "Please make liberal politicians and activists fear you." And then they said, "We are a global movement. We are as global as globalism itself." And it's true. This is a global movement. You can see the alliances with, Trump, his form of, desired form of governance. You look at someone like, Bolsonaro, who's also allied himself with sort of hyper-conservative evangelicalism in order to consolidate authoritarian power. I mean, these leaders around the world, they have a lot in common.
And this is not secretive. This is not like the secret privileged information conspiratorial shit. No. I mean, it is to a degree conspiratorial, literally a conspiracy, when you have somebody trying to undermine the post office so that you can minimize the vote. I mean, and what you were talking about with like gerrymandering, right? This is voter suppression. And people say, well, the Republican Party's not doing voter suppression. You're just paranoid because you're a leftist. What is gerrymandering?
Oh, it's horrifying. So Ralph Reed said that he's one of the most sort of powerful movement leaders. He called it the Republican reapportionment advantage. This is in advance of the 2018 elections in the states. He said, well, thanks to the Republican reapportionment advantage, if Democrats are up 1% to 3%, we win. And if they're up 4% to 7%, it's a jump ball. And if they're up 8%, 8 points or more, that's when they win. So it shows you, because of those dirty tricks, how much better and how much more support Democratic politicians have to get, and often to win elections. And Reid was completely unapologetic about this. He was like, oh, it's the Republican reapportionment advantage, as though this is like a kind of great thing. It's really sick. But what you said about, conspiracy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to say something. Like, people are like, is this conspiracy? Absolutely not. This is happening in plain sight. It's not that they're hiding. It's that we're not listening,
When you elect people to head different departments, and each of the people that you've selected is already famous for wanting to destroy that department. Like putting Betsy DeVos in charge of education, or putting Rick Perry in charge of the Department of Energy, which he didn't even know what the Department of Energy is, because he's that much of an astronomical moron. Yeah, but he wanted to get rid of it because he thought it was something else, I guess. And now he's in charge of it only because he wanted to get rid of it. And Ted Cruz was put in charge of NASA. Come on. I mean, obviously, this is not an accident.
Well, it's not just that they want to, eliminate the departments. I think it's more like they want to use their position of authority to enact agendas that they have long had, or that the plutocratic funders that they rely on have long had. So, like, for instance, Betsy DeVos has been active in education for decades. I think people often misunderstand her. She's not a stupid woman. She's been involved in trying to siphon money from public schools and direct it over to religious schools, get governments to directly fund religious schools. She's been trying to do that for decades, and she is really succeeding. She's really succeeding. with the help, of course, of the sort of conservatives on the Supreme Court. There was a case that was recently won, conservative for the conservative majority. It's called, I think it's Espinoza versus Montana Department of Education. Or Montana School District. It's basically loosening the purse strings for public money that we all pay into the taxpayer system going to religious schools. And this is something that she's wanted for decades. But she and her husband, they were really voucher initiatives that go before the taxpayer and get voted on by everybody are extremely unpopular. She devoted a lot of resources into putting a kind of a voucher initiative in front of the taxpayer for a vote. This was in Michigan. It was voted down. And after that, she and her husband kind of switched. They sort of adopted the language of school choice. I mean, everybody likes choice. We all want to have choices, right? But it effectively extinguishes the distinction between vouchers and charter schools. And so they said, we're just all in for school choice. And I think there are a lot of people who kind of get behind the idea of well-run charters. But, when she uses that sort of language, it erases that distinction. And then she and her husband were actually captured on audio saying something like, we need to be a little quiet about talking about these activities. It was Rich DeVos, her husband, who said that at a Heritage Foundation talk. He said,
so you have this third of the country, roughly, who is completely motivated to vote no matter what. And so they're the ones that own and control the country.
It's actually about a quarter. I think it's about 20 to maybe 20%, but they vote. Remember,
statistics that the Democratic Party was roughly a quarter, the Republican Party is roughly a quarter, and independents, such a collection of different parties, account for half.
Well, but half of America doesn't vote, or maybe 40%. So yeah.
Exactly. So there's our problem. We have an overwhelming majority, but they don't use it. And why don't they use it? Because all these people that whine, and I have no tolerance for these people at all anymore, who whine that your vote doesn't count. Why would they go through all the trouble for voter suppression and voter manipulation and trying to get all of the congregations to vote as a block and gerrymandering, all of this stuff, if your vote didn't count? Very obviously the vote does count. I'm not putting up with anybody saying that they're not going to vote because or it's a broken system. The only way to fix a broken system is to take control of it.
It's true.
And I don't know what else to say at this point. We're coming up on an hour and we're going to have to close it out. But I just want to hear from you. What do we do?
Well, there are things that we can do as individuals, and there are things we can only do when we join together collectively. As individuals, obviously, we can not just vote, but become, as Johnny Moore said at an Evangelicals for Trump event, which I attended virtually, you need to become an evangelist for the vote. And it's not just like, even if you're in a blue state, a reliably blue state, it's still really important to vote, because what needs to happen is not only does this agenda need to be defeated, but it needs to be defeated in such landslide numbers that it sends a message to these right-wing politicians that their political fortune is not going to be sustained by advocating these far-right policies. The reason they're adopting it because they think it's the most reliable path to political power. These politicians, many of them probably on a personal level, they don't have all of those extreme beliefs, but they adhere to them because they think that that's how you're going to get the vote that's going to continue your career, and it's how you're going to get the money for your re-election campaigns. So they need to be, we need to send an overwhelming message. So it's not just voting yourself. It's making sure, volunteer for the lady across the street. If she's got 3 kids, can I babysit your kids so you can go vote? Or can I give you a ride to the polls? Or can I help you get registered online so you can vote?
Yeah, I wouldn't do that in my neighborhood.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, you get out the right vote, of course. But we can do when we join together collectively. I mean, the right has invested in all those tools of modern campaign infrastructure. They've invested in policy groups. They've invested in messaging platforms. What I've learned is, almost over a decade of studying the right and the rise of the religious right before, is even small numbers of people can have an extraordinary impact on our society if they just join together and have a kind of idea that they're pursuing and are really kind of determined to do it. So they're using all the tools available in any modern democracy to destroy democracy. Those same tools can be used to restore it.
I'm glad to hear that. I have not been entirely hopeful of late.
Well, I'm not making predictions, but I remain optimistic.
Well, it's been great talking to you. You and I could talk for a long, long time, I'm sure, but it is coming up on an hour. I'm going to have to close it down. So Katherine Stewart, there's a link to her book in the description. Yeah. And if you need me to include any other links, just send them to me in an email and I'll just be sure to drop them in there. Thank you very much, Katherine Stewart.
Thank you so much.